Ever since we started this small holding here, there is one thing that just seems to tie everything we do together, whether it's like cooking in the kitchen, gardening out here, looking after the chickens, preparing for winter. One thing ties it all together, and that one thing is the composting. So in this video, I'm going to chat briefly about the basics of composting and how you can get started. I'll go through what we do here with this 3-bay system, also chat about some other ways I've done some composting on a much smaller scale in a city centre garden. I'll talk about what's worked, what hasn't worked, and therefore the lessons that I've learned on the journey. I also have the first round of compost that is done from this system, which I'm really excited to take a peek at and see how it looks. So what is composting? Composting is just absolutely fundamental if you have any interest in permaculture or self-sufficiency. It's not just about reducing your waste, it's about saving every bit of organic matter on your property, in your garden, in your house, and reusing it effectively to create more life and more food. So how does it actually work? Composting is basically the natural decomposition or breakdown of organic matter. So a compost pile isn't just a pile of your trash, it is like a little mini ecosystem all in itself. If we do it right, we can create the perfect environment for the microorganisms that break down that organic matter into something that is perfect for putting on our veggie beds to grow the next round of food. There's a lot of information out there and it sounds really complicated, but today let's just take it back to basics, keep it really simple, and hopefully I'll show you that anybody can get started doing some composting at home. I feel like it just makes sense. If you've got all this organic matter, you've got your cardboard boxes from your deliveries, you've got your food waste from the kitchen, things like that, maybe your grass clippings if you've got a lawn, or your hedge trimmings if you've got hedgerows. That's all stuff that you would otherwise have to throw away. That's stuff that you'd have to find another way to throw away. Sometimes, especially like garden waste in this country, you have to pay someone to come and take it. Rather than sending it off for someone else to make compost out of it, which is what most of our councils do, why not do it yourself and therefore get the end product, which is compost, out of it that you don't have to pay for. You know, even if that's on a small scale and you're not growing loads and loads of food, you might just have a few pots you want to grow flowers in, it would also be great for that. This also means that if you are growing veg and flowers and whatever else, you are so much less likely to need artificial fertilizers. You're so much less likely to have to go out and buy a fertilizer to put on whatever you're growing, because your soil will just be healthier if you're amending it with your own compost. As I said before, compost is alive. It's not just dirt, it's got a whole host of microorganisms in it that make your soil healthier. So it's not just a chemical that you're pouring on to a bed to make it grow better, it's actually making the soil healthier, which is a much more long-term benefit of compost. I think it really is the pinnacle of self-sufficiency. If you are not giving away any of your organic matter, you're keeping it in-house, you're reusing it, because most of that organic matter probably came from your house as well, especially if you're growing vegetables, your kitchen scraps, they came from this land. Rather than taking it and putting them in the bin, you're just putting it back in the ground that it came from. So how can you actually get started with composting at home? Well, first things first, you need somewhere to collect your compost. If you have a bigger garden or some land, you can have a big old compost heap or a big 3-bay system like this, but there are loads of ways to do it on a much smaller scale. So when I first started composting in the city, I had only a patio garden, so I had no dirt to go on, there was no ground, it was all just patio slabs, and I had a Dalek bin like this. So this is a way less pretty a bit of my land, but I'm just showing you it to show that I still do use one of these. I put any weeds that I think really probably will break down, but if I'm worried that my compost bin is not hot enough, we'll get to that in a minute, they come in here. So I like to have a separate bin for any perennial weeds that I'm not confident enough to put into my main compost bin. Before I moved out here, I just had one of these on some patio like this, and you know what? I still managed to make great compost. There are also like even smaller things like little boxes that go on a balcony, worm farms. There are loads of options out there, so find one that suits you and the space that you've got and the amount of waste that you've got. There is always a way to make compost at home, you just have to do some research. Okay, so let's talk about how to actually make compost, what goes in the bin once you've got it. Now, if you go searching this, there is loads of information online about it, but it can get a bit overwhelming when people start talking about ratios of like browns and greens. It is good to understand the principle of it, but I'll be honest with you, I don't do any calculating of ratios when I'm making my compost. The thing to know is that generally speaking, you want to be layering greens and browns. Browns are things like cardboard boxes, paper, leaves, like, you know, dried leaves that have fallen from your trees, wood chips, sawdust. We use sawdust from Nigel's workshop, only if it's from untreated wood, but we keep all of that and it goes on the compost. All of those things contribute to your browns. Approximately, I know someone will argue with me about this, approximately you want twice as many of those as you do your greens. So your greens is everything from your kitchen waste, you know, your veggie peelings, your grass clippings, anything green. A lot of people like to use coffee grounds as well. That also counts as a green. When the greens and the browns are well balanced in this 2-to-1-ish ratio, that is what allows the decomposition to be most efficient. But for me, I think it's good to understand what happens if you don't do that, because then you can keep an eye out and correct it. It's not the end of the world if you don't get it perfect straight away. It's just good to know what to look out for. So if you've got too many greens, it's like if you leave a pile of grass clippings just on its own, it go like sludge, you'll get that kind of thing, and that basically is a result of the pile becoming anaerobic. So if you've got too many browns, it'll probably start to look quite dried out. So just things to keep an eye on. So as long as you keep that general principle of balancing them in mind and keep an eye on things when you're turning it, you'll probably work out just fine. I mean, when I had the garlic bin, I never turned it at all because it's bloody hard to get a fork in there and be able to turn it. So I still got compost out of it. So I think even if you don't do things perfectly, you're still likely to get some compost out of there. So it is worth doing. So in an ideal world, when people are making really like hot piles and making one big batch of compost that they can trust exactly how long it's going to take to turn into a nice big pile of compost, they will make that pile in one session, complete it, and then leave it alone to cook and turn into compost, and then they'll come back after an appropriate amount of time and then they'll have compost to use, which is great if you've got, you know, if you're on a farm or if you're collecting sort of industrial organic waste from somewhere that you've got a lot en masse. Whereas for most households, you know, we don't generate that much organic matter in one go, and the idea of storing enough somewhere else just becomes impractical. So for me, I'm happy to build a compost pile over, say, a 6-month period, meaning that basically I will just keep adding to it over time as and when I have enough waste. Usually what makes me come out and do another layer is that my food waste caddy in the kitchen will be full. I'll bring it out here and throw it on there, and then I'll usually cover that over with a couple of layers of cardboard or any other brown, and then that constitutes the next layer, and then I just keep doing that week after week. Then when I'm happy that the pile is the size I want it to be, I cover it up with a layer of brown on top, and then I leave it alone. So rather than making it all in one go, I accept that I don't have enough waste to do that, and so I gradually build a pile. Both work. Building it all in one go is much quicker. It will get you compost much more efficiently, but realistically it's got to work for you and how much organic waste you have. If you can't build a one big pile all in one go, don't worry about it. Get on and do it anyway. Start that pile. Now what you do need to do with a compost pile, especially if you're layering it over time, is to turn it. That is the downside to the Dalek bins. That's quite difficult to do, whereas with an open bay like this, or even just a pile on the ground, it's much easier to get in there with a fork and turn it over. This is basically because you want to keep oxygen in there, you don't want it to get too compacted. As I say, there's living things in there and they need oxygen to survive. So by getting the fork in there, turning the pile over, you keep it nice and aerated. Okay, let's take a look at my system I'm currently using, and I'll give you the principle of why we've done it like this. Now this was the absolute first thing that we did when we moved in after the land was cleared. Nigel built this out of old fencing that we found in fallen down in the grass when the fields got cleared. So doesn't take anything expensive to do this necessarily. It can be put together with pallets, things like that. So it can be a nice cheap project as long as you're willing to be a bit handy. Now I've got 3 bays here. The principle of a 3-bay system is that at any one time you have one bay that's being filled, which for me at the moment is this middle pile. You have one bay that is cooking or that is filled but you're leaving it alone because it's not ready yet. That for me is this pile. And then you have one which is done that you're actively using. Now I'm in my first year here, so I don't have one of those yet. This is as close to done as I've got. But that's the principle of having 3. One actively being filled, one cooking, and one done and actively being used. So this bay here with the fork in it is my compost basically. So when we first moved in and we set this up, I filled this up for the first 6 months of us being here, and then I've left it alone ever since, except for turning it every couple of months. Probably should be more than that, but being honest, that's what we did. And this is what it looks like. Now, because I didn't make one big pile all in one go, it's not evenly decomposed. There are still some bits in there, but that's not a problem for me. I think what I'm going to do with it now is pop it on my beds. I did some no-dig beds this season, which I'm really happy with. I just want to do more. So what I'm going to do, the beds are getting cleared, as you see in this pile behind me. That's where all the sort of remnants of the plants are going. So what I'm going to do is put a nice healthy layer of this compost onto those beds, throw some mulch over the top, and then leave it for the winter. Any bits that aren't broken down will just go into the next bay, which is the one I'm currently filling. I'm honestly super chuffed with how this looks. It looks, for the most part, like compost, which I think is really exciting. You know, you never quite know. It never seems likely when you fill it all up with all this, what feels like a big pile of junk. It's hard to really believe that it's going to actually turn into compost. I was exactly the same when I used the Dalek bin in my old house. I kept throwing stuff in thinking there's no way this is going to turn into compost, but you know what? It did. Maybe one day I'll get used to the idea that it actually works, but still, that's how good it looks. Super chuffed. So this bay behind me now, this is the one I'm actively filling up. So I think what we'll do is keep filling this one up over winter, and then come spring next year, I'll leave this one to cook over the summer. As you can see in there, we've got some old plants that have just come out of the beds. There's some chicken bedding because we have chickens, so that's also great for the compost. The chickens are free ranging now out in the food forest area, so we get less and less of their droppings for the compost, but the bedding still goes in here, as I say, along with all our food waste and hedge clippings and things like that. I try to keep it in green brown layers, but you know, at the end of the day, it all goes in there. It all gets turned in at some point, so I'm not too fussy with it. I do just keep throwing stuff in there. What I would say is that if you're new to composting, something that will probably shock you is how little compost you actually make when it looks like a huge pile. You know, the one that is done now, that was, you know, full up. It really does condense down quite a lot, so don't be shy. If it fits in the bin, put it in the bin. It will compress down. As it breaks down, it will shrink and shrink and shrink, and that'll give you more space to add more on top if you're building it up as you go. The last bay is currently empty. Weeds grow in there because it's empty space, but that will be the next one that I start filling up. As time goes by, these 3 bays should make more sense. So how do you know when it's done? Basically, going to look like compost. Ready compost should be dark, crumbly like, just as it would come out of a bag, and the smell, you know, it should just be like that earthy damp smell rather than anything nasty. It may still have bits that haven't broken down in it. That doesn't mean you can't use the rest. If I've left any bits too big in there, I just tend to just pull them out and put them into the next one. So I hope all that makes sense, and I hope I have given you some ideas as to how you might be able to start doing some composting at your own home. It really is so important if you're, as I say, if you have any interest in sort of self-sufficiency. It's not about not ever needing to buy things. It's just about not wasting the things that you've already got. By using those things we've already got, we're just creating a healthier environment in our gardens for whatever purpose we want from it, whether it's more food or just to look beautiful. Understanding how composting works is only going to give you a more sustainable and resilient system at home. So I really do encourage you to go and try it. And if you have any questions on anything I've said, then please do ask below. Thank you so much. Cheers, guys.